Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Policy Analysis and Intro to Debate and paper lecture. We were supposed to do this originally across two classes, but it actually makes sense to do it across one. So I guess it almost works out nicely that we had Zoom problems on Tuesday. So I've kind of integrated both sets of slides into one to save repetition and hopefully make it a little bit more clear for you as we go forward. So since the paper will be related to policy analysis, we can handle it all in one. All right, so for the final project, there's two components. So there's the debate component and there's the policy analysis paper. So just quickly on the policy paper, and we'll return to it in a second, but it's a policy analysis paper. So on one of the debates on topics that we'll be having in the future in the group debate, so similar types of topics that we've been dealing with, you'll be doing an analysis paper, so a longer kind of looking at, okay, how we can solve this problem. So what solutions can we implement as Canadians? Now, you're not necessarily restricted to doing it for Canada, so you could choose another country or set of countries, but in general, it'll probably be for Canadians. What type of plans can the government and society put in place to solve this problem? They're a maximum of 7 pages, double space times New Roman 1-inch margins, normal margins, due December 1st. In these 7 pages, any extra text, so any tables you want to put in or graphs or anything like that don't count towards 7 pages. Any reference list or anything like that at the end does not count towards the 7 pages. So I'm really talking when I say maximum 7 pages, that 7 pages of writing, of your own writing. And then citation style, Chicago or APA in text. We'll talk more about citation style later as you're getting further into the paper. It's not too important for now, but just bear in mind that that's the route that we'll be going. All right, so selecting your topic, and so this will influence kind of both projects. So for your group presentation, each group will select an important social problem that's currently being debated in society. So we've already had a series of debates, and so moving forward in it, and in a couple of weeks, you'll be choosing kind of your group topic and your group. But you'll be continuing, so we've had a series of debates, you'll be choosing a different topic, one that we haven't had. So it could be a debate or a social issue or anything like that. And you'll be leading the discussion on it. So for example, I did a presentation on, and last time on prostitution, so kind of the arguments for legalizing and against legalizing. So I did a presentation and then opened up and I presented a series of questions that I wanted you to discuss, and then sent you into your breakout groups for the discussion, right? So each of you in your group debate will do something similar. So now you can choose to, you could have a slightly different structure than what I would do. That's fine, you can innovate. That's always exciting to do innovation, but there should be some form of component of a presentation of the topic, right? So what are the arguments for, this topic? For example, in the prostitution one, for legalizing prostitution, what are the arguments against legalizing prostitution? So that should be some component of the group presentation, and then there should be some form of class discussion. Now, whether you want to do it as a full class discussion, whether you want to do breakout groups, whether you want to have some form of structured debate, rather than kind of just answering the series of questions, that's up to you. You can come up with whatever you believe to be best. The group presentations will be 30 minutes, so you need to come up with kind of some form of breakdown for the time. So do you want to be having 15 minutes on the intro and then 15 minutes for discussion, 20 minutes for the intro, 10 minutes for discussion, 10 minutes for the it's up to you how you want to break down your time. But the important thing that you'll be doing moving forward, and we will have a class on just explicitly choosing your topic, but you'll want to start thinking about it is what additional social problems or social issues do you want to discuss? There's so many. There's a really, really long list of topics that could have gone into this class. I chose some that I wanted us to discuss, but there's all kinds of other ones. And so I let you kind of shape the syllabus to a certain extent by choosing the topics that are most interesting to you. So that's how the group presentation will work. So you'll essentially be all those different discussions that we've been having so far in class. It'll be your turn as a group to lead them. So it won't be me presenting. I'll just participate and observe rather than kind of lead it. For your paper, so for the policy analysis paper, you'll be building off the group discussion. So you'll individually write a policy analysis of that issue. So each of you, so for example, if your group had chosen prostitution, you can't because we've done it, but I'm going to use that one because it was our most recent discussion, and it's one that you can choose, right? So for your paper, if your group chose prostitution, each member would have to write a policy analysis paper of that issue, right? So how can we solve the problem that's been identified? So there's some social bad that's been identified or some problem that's been identified. How can we resolve that problem? Now you could focus on the entire issue, but sometimes that's going to be more difficult, right? Because prostitution just on its face is hard to identify, what is the social issue, what is the bad? Yes, there's a debate about whether it should be legalized or not, but not everyone necessarily agrees that prostitution itself is good or bad. There is some debate there, so to say it's a problem itself, it depends on your viewpoint. But there are other things, for example, that most people would agree on, right? So you could choose, for example, still related to your topic, you could do violence against sex workers. Everyone would agree that that's a problem, right? So that could be your paper. So related to your group's discussion on prostitution, you could be writing a paper on how do we resolve violence against sex workers, or sex trafficking, right? Which is another problem related to prostitution that everyone would agree, or almost everyone would agree is a problem. I suppose traffickers don't, but pretty much everyone would agree is a problem. And so you want to write your paper on kind of analysis. How can we improve the situation? How can we lessen the problem? How can we resolve the problem? If you, some other ones may be more open to look at the entire issue, something like income inequality. You could be on policies to address income inequality, right? What are solutions that could be, now you could look at something more specific, like some subpart of income inequality, but you could probably there just look at an evaluation, a series of different policies that could be used for income equality. So it really depends on your problem whether you need to look at a subpart, but as long as it's related to your group topic, it's fine. But like, for example, say your group paper were on prostitution, you couldn't really write an income inequality paper, right? That they don't really fit together as topics. So you are somewhat restricted, but there still is some flexibility. So you're not all going to be all members of the group writing kind of the same individual paper. So that's kind of how it goes. So you're going to be choosing your topics that's interesting. You'll go into a group. We'll work on kind of the group selection process. Hopefully we'll get everyone into their first choice group on the first choice topic, but we'll do our best to, if not, still find a topic that everyone's interested in. And so while there's a lot of work on kind of these two things, the nice thing is that a lot of the research, for example, that you'll do into your group presentation may also help you with your individual paper. And a lot of the research you're, say, doing for your individual paper may actually help you with your group presentation. So you're going to be getting a lot of expertise on the topic, and the more expertise you get on the topic, it's going to help you with both projects. A lot of the effort will be helping you with two different things, which makes it less work kind of overall to do the two projects. All right, so kind of as you're getting started, with kind of a policy analysis. So think of, you now got your problem, right? You've chosen, let's say that we're doing it on sex trafficking or trafficking, and then some key questions that you want to be starting to think about when you want to start doing policy analysis is what factors of the problem is likely to be most important to the client. So client in this sense would be like, assume that, say, the government hired you to solve it, right? What factors of the problem is most likely to be important? It's not necessarily the government who hired you. You can just drop the client here, right? But here, just think of what factors of the problem are most likely to be most important, right? There's going to be a whole bunch of different aspects to a problem, right? Not all of them will be of the same importance in terms of solving it, right? So think about what are the different factors at play here, and which ones are probably most important. What actors are likely to be involved in the issue, and what are their beliefs and motivations, right? So in terms of solving a problem, there's going to be all kinds of different people who are involved, right? So for example, in kind of the sex trafficking issue, right, to be solving it within Canada, there's multiple stakeholders at multiple levels, right, involved. So you've got government, who will be the ones, say, for example, potentially passing the laws or who have to be dealing with the issue. You've got those who will be putting pressure, so kind of interested civil society groups who might be interested in it. So because it's related, say, to prostitution, you may have some religious groups who are getting involved. You may have some feminist groups who are putting pressure on the government depending on what policy actions, right? So for example, say one of your solutions to sex trafficking that you're proposing or that you're looking at would be legalization of prostitution, right? So if that were to be proposed, well, you'd have to be prepared for there'd be some pushback from certain groups, including many religious groups, right? So who are likely to be involved kind of in satisfying this issue, and what are their beliefs and motivations, right? So what's important to them, and what's going to get them to be acting. Then at another level, you've got, for example, for sex trafficking, right? You've got the traffickers, so the people who are importing them or selling them, selling women and men into selling them. You've got, say, pimps involved kind of in the prostitution side more locally, right? You've got the victims, right? And then you've got those who those who buy the services. Without clients, there's no trafficking, right? If there's no demand for trafficked girls, then and boys, there's no it wouldn't be happening, right? So you've also then got the client side, right? So those are all kind of some, and there's more different actors, but these are some of the different actors who are kind of involved in this, right? And you've got to always be thinking about all of their different motivations and how are they, throughout the process, how are they going to be reacting, right? Because you could come up with an easy solution from the government perspective. Okay, government does this, and the government would be happy, the religious group will be happy, the feminists will be happy. Oh, but the traffickers, right? They're just going to find a way around it, right? You didn't take them into account. Oh, well, then your policy is probably not going to work, right? Or it could be something that would actually really, really work with the traffickers, with all the people on kind of that level, and the government is actually okay with it, but the stakeholders, kind of the civil society groups, make it so that it could never pass, right? It would be effective, but just politically, it's not feasible. So you always have to think about that. And then on what criteria is a decision likely to be made, right? So there's all kinds of different things that we come into when that are important factors that are important in evaluating policy, right? And which ones in this particular case are most likely to affect the decision, right? So is it that the government, when they're making a decision on the policy they want to implement, they just want the cheapest one that might help, right? As long as it makes the problem slightly better, they'll take the cheapest one. Is it one that they want? Do they want a quick solution, a quick and easy solution to implement, so something that's efficient, right? Easy to implement, quick solutions. Do they want it to be equitable, right? So one that doesn't get, you could have a policy that helps one group, right? So it could be those who are trafficked from Europe, but not from Latin America, right? So it reduces the problem because you have a reduction in, say, boys and girls or men and women trafficked from Eastern Europe, but you have no change in those trafficked from Latin America or Africa or Asia. Has it helped the problem? Yes. Has it done so necessarily in an equitable way? No. Income inequality, right? You could develop a program that helps reduce income inequality among men. Has it helped the problem in general? Yes. Has it done so in a fair way? No, right? Because I mean, yeah, it's great that we've reduced income inequality among 50% of the population, but that's 50% that's systematically left out, right? Uh, that's so yes, it's improved the problem, but it's still, you know, in a lot of ways, probably not the ideal solution. And so it could be that the government's priority is they want an equitable solution, so one that helps everybody involved equally. Um, so these are things, and we'll come back to it, but just kind of some things to be thinking about. So say it with numbers, right? Some tips as you're kind of going through the entire process. Numbers are needed to resolve most policy problems, right? Because numbers help us understand the magnitude of the problem, so the cost of the problem, how many people are affected, stuff like that. And so there's usually data available on any of these different problems. If you go on Google, you can always find different reports that are written on any of the problems you're going to be choosing. For any of the problems you're going to be choosing, there's going to be just simply through Google, there'll be no shortage of numbers. And numbers can really help to make more clear to anybody reading it that, hey, this is a real problem and that this solution could really help with it. But you always want to be cautious when you're using numbers. There's a lot of bad numbers out there. So some things to think about is, what is the source of the data, right? Is this coming from a reputable source where we trust the numbers, or is this coming from, you know, just any average website where the numbers can be made up, or is it potentially coming from a biased source, right? So, for example, say you had an environmental regulations, a question about environmental regulations, right? If you get a website that's run by an oil company, they're going to be potentially putting out very different numbers on kind of the same type of issue compared to something that an environmental lobby will be putting out. And whose numbers are accurate? But well, actually, potentially both of them are presenting misleading because they both have an agenda. And so you've got to be careful in both cases, potentially, that the numbers aren't being skewed in some way. Not necessarily that they're lying, but they're being a little bit misleading in how they're presenting the data because they have a goal in presenting the data. So it's always best as if possible to use multiple sources. If you've got multiple different sources that are presenting numbers that are telling you the same story, then you can be more confident that the story you're telling is accurate. Check the facts, right? So as much as this kind of goes along with using multiple sources, right? If you're seeing some fact and you're not sure whether it's true, always verify. And check definitions, particularly when you're looking at numbers. Always look at kind of how are they defining the different things, right? So in terms of, say, crime, right? So say you have a project somehow related to crime, right? And one group says that there's been, you know, a big upsurge in crime. There's a lot of crime going on right now, and they pull out crime stats, and they want to show that it's a huge number of crimes per 100,000 people, number of criminal incidents in Montreal per 100,000 people, right? And they want to say that there's a big problem, and so we need to be addressing it, right? And so they present numbers, and it does seem like a shockingly high amount of crime per 100,000 people. Well, you might want to look at how are they defining crime, right? Are they defining crime as everything from you know, violent crime to robbery to theft to, you know, public indecency, loitering, like everything from you know, violent crime to property crime down to the lowest level kind of misdemeanors. Are they putting all of those in crime? And then one who's saying, hey, there's not much crime is only putting in violent crime, right? Like, how are they defining crime? So if the debate's about violent crime and one of them who's saying, hey, we've got a lot of violent crime, is putting property crime in with violent crime, they're presenting misleading statistics. Those aren't the best numbers for a discussion about violent crime, right? So you want to make sure that the numbers being presented and that the definitions being used in those numbers actually kind of fit your problem, right? Avoid the toolbox approach. So this isn't something that I'm too worried about for most of you, because you probably aren't particularly attached to any method yet. But in general, you don't want to get too attached to one particular method of analysis. So this is just a good advice for anything you're doing, even outside of policy analysis. Any studies that you're doing, even in, whether you're in natural sciences or social sciences, or any kind of place where you're doing any form of inquiry. Don't get too attached to one particular method of analysis. There's all kinds of different methods that can be used for answering problems, and you want to choose always the best method for your problem. You don't want to be someone who, always uses statistical analysis, or always uses a case study, or always uses an experiment to solve every different problem. Not every problem can be solved equally well with a particular method. So you want to let your research be problem driven, not method driven. In general, use the simplest appropriate method, right? So you obviously don't want to be too simplistic, right? But you also don't want to be too convoluted. It just leads to excess complication. It makes your job as a researcher harder if you get overly complex, but it also just makes it harder for the other people to understand. Use common sense to design an approach if one doesn't already exist. I think just in general, using common sense is a good kind of starting point. And use more than one method whenever possible. And just in general, I think one of the biggest takeaways is make the analysis simple and clear. So don't get over complex. Really, anybody who's reading your analysis or any paper that you're writing, the main thing is they want to be able to understand what you're saying. So clarity is very, very important. So what are the primary steps in the kind of the policy analysis and in the papers that you'd be doing? So primary steps, so verify, define, and detail the problem. And we'll go through each of them in turn. Establish evaluation criteria, identify alternative policy options, evaluate the alternative options, select among the alternative options, and monitor outcomes. Now, monitor outcomes, because we're not actually implementing any policy, you won't be doing in the paper. But these first 5 you'll be doing, right? So first step, you need to say, what is the problem that we're talking about? You're saying there's a problem we need to solve. What is the problem we need to solve? Now, you're going to be proposing solutions to this problem. So one of the steps before you can even start proposing solutions is set out clear rules about how you're going to be evaluating the different proposals. So say you say there's 5 different possible solutions to the problem, and we need to choose the best one. Well, what are the rules you're going to be using for choosing the best one? Is it, like we talked about before, is it just the cheapest one, right? Cost is really important, so we just want to take the cheapest one. Is it we want the most equitable one, so the one that helps, everyone fairly, equally. It may not be the one that leads to the greatest gains, but everybody gets a share of the gains. So and we'll come back to what it means. So once you've kind of set up your rules for how you're going to be evaluating different options, you need to identify the different options, right? So what are all the different options that are available for solving this problem? So if it's human trafficking for kind of purposes of sex or sex trafficking, what are the different options we have for dealing with the problem? Then you want to, related to the evaluation criteria, you want to evaluate the alternative options, and then use some way for selecting among the alternative options. And then once you would do, say, implement one, then it would be monitor outcomes. But that we're not going to be doing. And these last 2 are kind of, in terms of the paper, will be overlapping sections, because you kind of evaluate them almost kind of like outside the paper, and then present them and select among them, usually kind of within the paper. So some elements that need to come into verifying, defining, and detailing the problem, and things that this is usually going to be kind of the earliest part of your paper. So first thing you need to do is, what is the problem? So you need to define the problem and convince your reader, hey, this is something you should be caring about. And kind of one of the best ways that, and they refer to it in the pattern piece back of the envelope calculations, but really it's just kind of like in the intro, the first things you want to be doing are just presenting and really convincing your reader what is the size of the problem. So what's the problem, but what's the size of it, number of people affected by the problem, and costs of the problem. So for example, if you've got income inequality, right? So magnitude of the problem, you could have, showing that statistics on the how much the richest 10% get and how much the bottom 10% or bottom 50% get, right? What does the 1% get compared to the bottom 50%? Or however you want to look at it and show, okay, so we see that there's clearly a big issue. Now, that's showing that there's a disparity. We haven't necessarily shown its problem yet. And then numbers of people affected by the problem. So who are those who are kind of getting left behind? And then what are the costs of the problem? Like, why is this so bad, right? So you could be showing in the magnitude and cost of the problem that, people in the bottom 50% have trouble, many of them have trouble just meeting the basic requirements of living. So many are kind of living in poverty, but even then, even the middle class is having trouble kind of living the life that the middle class used to do. And then what does this do to the economy, right? If we're doing kind of the sex trafficking, right? So what's the magnitude of the problem, number of people affected? So kind of how many people are being trafficked? What are the negative consequences of being trafficked? So magnitude of the problem, and then cost of the problem. So what's it cost in terms of, say, hospitalizations and sexually transmitted disease in terms of kind of cost? So a lot of these will, depending on the problem, will overlap, but you just really want to be convincing your reader that, people are being affected by this, that there's a number of people being affected, that it's causing them a problem, and detailing the problem, and that there's a cost to society of this, right? And you want to really be describing it in a way that's showing that this is something that we need to be caring about. You'll want to be presenting things like a brief history, so political history and political variables that affect the problem. So give me a brief, so if we're talking about, say, sex trafficking in Canada or income inequality in Canada, what is the history of income inequality in Canada? What is the history of sex trafficking in Canada? And who are the kind of key actors who are involved? So what's the situation in terms of how is it developed in Canada, and who are the key stakeholders, who are the key actors involved in the problem and potentially involved in finding a solution? And then creation of valid operational definitions, right? So this kind of goes back to where we were talking about sometimes with stats, you can see kind of misleading statistics and you have to look at the definitions, right? So having clear definitions for everything is always important, right? So if we're going to be talking about income inequality and solving the problem of income inequality, you need to very quickly establish a clear definition of what income inequality means and what it does not mean, right? Because if we're not clear on what exactly it means, it's hard to understand it as a problem, but it's also hard to evaluate solutions. Same thing, what does sex trafficking mean, right? All these different ones, what does trafficking mean? All the different terms potentially involved in this case. So, in that type of paper, you may need clear ones of prostitution, sex trafficking, separating trafficking from sex trafficking, right? Because not all trafficking is for sexual purposes. So making sure that you've got very clear definitions of all the relevant terms to your problem. So this is kind of the first steps is, it's kind of just, you define the problem, give kind of a history to the problem and those who are involved in it, and make sure that you've got very clear definitions for moving forward in terms of all the key terms related to your problem. So that's kind of the first stage of the paper. The second stage of the paper is evaluation criteria, right? So this is kind of where we're setting up the rules for how we are going to be looking at different policies and judging how good each of the different policies are, right? So we could be doing in terms of the two main categories would be effects and implementation. So effects, will the solution do what we want it to do, right? And we can judge this in terms of effectiveness, unintended effects, and equity. And we'll return to each of these. And then implementation, is a solution something that we can do? And we look at this in terms of, say, cost, feasibility, and acceptability. Now, obviously, in your paper, you're not going to be able to choose. All of these are important in judging a policy. And in a full policy analysis, not outside of this type of class, you'd want to be looking at most of these, if not all of these. In your paper, obviously, you're not going to have room to judge each of the different policies on all of these. So you may want to choose a subset. Maybe you want to choose one from effects and one from implementation, or maybe you want to just do the effect side and leave out the implementation side, right? You could be honest in the paper saying all of these are important, but for kind of room, I'm going to prioritize these evaluation criteria because I think they're going to be particularly important to these stakeholders, right? And then go from there, because you're just not going to have the room to do all of these in 7 pages. So effectiveness, right? So the first element used to assess the success of public policy is effectiveness at achieving its objectives. It's also necessary to report possible absence of effects, right? So it's possible that it's going to do nothing, or negative effects of the policy that could make things worse. It's often difficult to judge the ultimate effects, right? Now, obviously, in this case, you're not going to be able to be monitoring effects, right? So we're not going to know, but you for any given solution, you may be looking other places that it's been put in place, or using kind of logic. But you're going to want to make an argument. If you choose effectiveness, you're going to want to be evaluating in terms of how confident are we that this proposal, right, this policy that we're proposing, is going to actually do the thing that we want it to do. Now, bear in mind, this isn't something that's going to come too much into your paper, but you do want to bear in mind that often when we're looking at effectiveness, it's difficult to necessarily always show kind of a full cause-effect relationship. So it could be difficult, for example, if we put in a public policy of nutrition labeling, right, because we want to be dealing with obesity, it's going to be very hard to draw causal kind of inferences or identify kind of the effect itself of labeling on obesity, right? Just with the way that data exists on public health, it'd be very, very hard to track whether it was, for example, the labeling that led to any changes in obesity. So when we want to be evaluating policy, sometimes we have to look at kind of intermediate effects. So are we able to show that nutrition labeling was read by consumers? Right? Are we able to show that for those who read the labeling, it was well understood? Are we able to show that those who understood it were then better informed consumers, right? And then who purchased healthier food? So are we able to show each of these different steps? The more of these steps that we can show, then and many of these would be possible to show, then we can draw better conclusions about whether the labeling had an impact on obesity, right? And so this is something, for example, say you want to be looking at a program that another country has implemented to deal with a similar problem to the one that, say, we're facing in Canada, right? If you want to be judging whether that policy has been effective in the other country, you may not always be able to see kind of a clear impact that it's necessarily been the cause of any change, but you may be able to show through kind of intermediate effects that it's worked. But I wouldn't be, again, in the size of the papers that we're dealing with, I wouldn't be overly worried about intermediate effects, but it is kind of something that still I wanted to bring up. Right, next is unintended consequences, right? So you could also find that your kind of the policy that has been implemented is very effective, right? It's doing the thing we wanted to do, but it also maybe at the same time be producing other effects that were kind of unintended, right? Effects that are produced by implementing the public policy under study, but that are unrelated to the objective pursued. So for example, say you're trying to combat obesity, so you end up combating obesity, but you end up creating a different health problem, or a problem that's not even related to health at all, Effects are external to the chain of effects, right? And so given the complexity of human societies, it's impossible to control a policy so fully as to ensure that it produces only the desired effect and no other unintended effects can be positive or negative. If they're positive, if the policy is effective and it has a positive unintended effect, bonus points, right? It's not only is it dealing with the problem that we had, but it's also dealing with another problem. Fantastic, right? But oftentimes the unintended consequences are negative. They introduce a new problem, right? They deal with our existing problem, but they introduce a new problem. And in that case, we have to see, is it worthwhile? Is the new problem it's introducing worse than the kind of the previous problem? Or is it that, it was the most effective, it was most effective at dealing with income inequality, but it led to substantial slowdowns in the economy. For example, could be an unintended consequence, right? We deal with income inequality, we shrink income inequality, but the entire economy slows down. And so it could be the best policy at dealing with income inequality, but because of these unintended consequences, maybe we choose the second best policy for dealing with income inequality, but that does not lead to a slowdown in the economy. And so that's kind of one of the things we want to be thinking about potentially are unintended consequences. And so those are things that we could factor in. And then equity. The aim is to determine whether the policy being analyzed produces different effects on various groups. It can be categorized by age, gender, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, religion, residence in certain zones, sexual orientation, disabilities, etc. Or whether it could potentially create, increase, or correct inequalities in the distribution of the targeted. So does the proposed policy affect groups differently? Now, if it helps to reduce inequalities, fantastic. That's a great thing. Or if it applies to all groups equally, right? If it's also fantastic, right? But if it increases inequalities, or if it only helps certain groups, right? It only helps men, it only helps older people, it only helps people in Quebec, it only helps heterosexual people or people without disabilities, right? Then we might question, we prefer a policy that helps everybody, that doesn't leave out various groups. And particularly, we're sensitive about whether it's going to leave out particular groups if those groups are already disadvantaged, right? So if it's for example, say we're trying to reduce income inequality and a policy helps the middle class but leaves out the poorest people. Now, yes, it's helped reduce income inequality, fantastic, right? But the group that we most want to be helping would be the most disadvantaged. And so a policy that's leaving out the most disadvantaged would be problematic, or something that, like I brought up earlier, one that helps out men, reduces income inequality for men, but not for women. Women are already, in terms of income inequality, the most disadvantaged group. So something that that accentuates that, the one in terms of income, that's the most, already has the greatest problems, would be women compared to men, right? So any policy that's kind of helping men with wages but leaving women behind further, it could be problematic. All right, so cost. So when considering financial costs, we tend to think first of the cost incurred by government in implementing the policy under state. So how much is it going to cost the government to put in? But there's also other elements of cost that we can think about. So it could generate gains. So it could help bring in, for example, taxes. So we don't want to only think about what are the costs to the government, but what are also potential gains for the government. So it may cost a certain amount to bring in. So it may cost, say, $1 million in the first 5 years, but then over the next 50 years, it'll bring in $1 million each year. So it costs, I think, it's 10 million, right, to get started, but then over the next 50 years, it'd bring in 50 million. So yes, 10 million may seem like expensive, but if we're going to be bringing in gains, the 10 million more gains, the 10 million doesn't seem so bad. And we also don't want to only focus on costs incurred by the government. We also want to think in terms of costs and gains for other actors. Something we also often do in terms of cost is looking at relative costs. So compare the cost of the policy under study with costs of other potential policies or with inaction, right? And so this is something that we're going to be doing when we're comparing policies. So for example, say something costs $10 million, right? That may sound expensive and you're looking and we're like, I don't know if we can afford that. But we're already paying 20 million for the problem and all the other policies would cost 30 million. Then all of a sudden in terms of relative costs, 10 million doesn't sound so bad, particularly if an action already costs more. So we've got a problem and it's costing 20 million in now. So obesity, right? Obesity because of higher than health risks associated with obesity, the provinces are paying tens of millions of extra dollars dealing with kind of those medical consequences of obesity, right? So if they're already paying tens of millions, so doing nothing means we're paying tens of millions. So then if there's a policy proposal that's going to reduce obesity, right, by a certain amount, and it costs 10 million, right? So we're not comparing 10 million to zero. We're comparing 10 million to how much it's, 10 million and it's not going to solve the whole problem. So 10 million plus the medical costs that we would be having compared to the medical costs that we currently have. And then we'd want to be seeing which one's lower. Feasibility, right? So we could find all kinds of wonderful actions that don't cost much that would be, really would have no negative unintended consequences, that would have positive effects, that would be equitable. So great policies, right? But we have to be able to implement them. And so this is about examining the technical feasibility of the policy being analyzed. So for example, do we have the resources? So it costs $10 million. Do we have $10 million? If we don't have $10 million, it doesn't really matter how good the policy is. We can't afford it. We can't do it. Conformity with the laws, right? So to a certain extent, if the government implements a policy, they can change laws. But for example, it still has to be constitutional, right? And unless they're willing to change certain laws, it also has to fit within laws, right? So it has to be something that's legal within the country. There has to be availability of administrative mechanisms, right? So there has to be people who can administer the program and management of those. So we also have to be able to oversee those who are implementing the program to make sure that they do it possible, right? So do we have kind of the technical management and administration resources? In Canada, this often isn't a problem. In some other parts of the world that have less developed governments, implementing government programs effectively, right, can be a real big challenge, right? You could design a program to say help a less developed country solve a big problem. But often these programs require a lot of government resources, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of kind of supervision on the ground to make sure all the resources are used properly. So they're not going to be siphoned up kind of corruptly, and often those kind of administration parts, the bureaucracy part, the oversight part are missing. And then ability of opponents to interfere, right? So you can, if you're trying to implement the policy, can those who are opposed to it, can they interfere in kind of the effective implementation? So if it's one dealing with trafficking and you're putting in place kind of a policy to deal with trafficking, can the traffickers do something to get around it, right? You put in this blockade or this form of block on trafficking, but if they're able to just open a new route around the block, then, I mean, yeah, the block's effective, but in and of itself, but it hasn't really solved the problem. Acceptability. So this is kind of the public side to feasibility. So feasibility is kind of more on the technical side, and this is more on the will everybody involved, the humans involved, go along. So how the proposed public policy is judged by stakeholders. So A policy that does not garner enough support, including the support of public opinion of those with economic and financial power, is likely to have difficulty being adopted and implemented and may thus have difficulty producing the desired effects. Weak acceptability does not necessarily mean the policy should be shelved. The policy performed can help decision makers zero on how to present the policy to stakeholders in a way that addresses their respective concerns and reduces their reticence, right? So just because something is unacceptable to certain kind of involved groups, right? Those groups may not be strong enough to make it so that the policy can't be implemented, right? So there, for example, if your solution to sex trafficking is legalizing prostitution, because there has been proposed links between them, right? So legalizing prostitution may get pushed back from some religious groups, and that will put pressure on the government, but it may not be something that's swaying enough public opinion to make it so that the laws wouldn't be able to be implemented or that there'd be unacceptable electoral consequences. So it may be that even the groups that find it unacceptable aren't able to have a big enough kind of pushback. It's also possible that even though they're going to have a pushback, there's a way to manage it in terms of how you frame the debate, how you frame the issue, right? So if you present it in a way where, yes, legalizing prostitution is something the religious groups don't want, but by doing so, you are solving something else that religious groups wanted solved, right? So if you could frame it in a way that's more acceptable, it's less about prostitution, it's more about something else, and something that that group cares about, it may be easier to kind of address their concerns if you can kind of present the problem differently. But particularly in a democracy, acceptability is important. And we're not just talking public opinion, we're also dealing with, those who are kind of involved in it. So if it's a legalization of prostitution, this is something that, for example, prostitutes are going to accept. Are they going to work in the legal market? Because obviously to have sex trafficking be minimized, and most of prostitution has to take place within the legal market. If there continues to be a substantial black market, then sex trafficking can continue within that black market, and you're not really going to address the problem. So are all of those involved willing to accept and move into, for example, into the legal market? So here's it's kind of a flow chart of how some of these can influence each other. For your paper, it's not too important, but just kind of to show how, for example, the different effects can have can influence acceptability. So for example, something that's going to be super effective is likely to be viewed as more acceptable than something that's not particularly effective. Something that's very equitable, helping everybody, is more likely to be viewed as acceptable. Something with huge negative unintended consequences is likely not to be viewed as acceptable by those who are suffering the cost of the unintended consequences. Feasibility and acceptability will feed into each other, as will cost. So if something's really, really costly, it's probably not going to be viewed as acceptable by large segments of the population. If something's not particularly costly, then most of the public are probably going to say, even if they don't particularly care about the policy, that, go for it, right? If it costs, $50 to solve a problem, who cares if you're a government? If it costs $20 million or $1 billion, maybe, more in the public will care because they're going to say, there's other things we could have done with that $1 billion. Here's just kind of out of the text, kind of a summary of the different aspects of, or kind of some of the sub criteria for evaluation criteria. So things to look at, kind of questions to look at for effectiveness or unintended consequences. So in terms of your paper, to how to be looking for these or how to be structuring your evaluation criteria, this is a super useful table. So I just wanted to put it here, but it is in your text because I know it's small to read here, but it is in your text. So I definitely suggest when you're thinking about your paper, when you're thinking about writing your evaluation or building your evaluation criteria section, and when you're then also going to be using the evaluation criteria to look at different policies, take a look at this because it's really useful. So things like for equity, does the policy create, reinforce, or correct social inequalities in health? this is assuming you're dealing with a health one. Change health for any other term if it's a different one. What are the effects, intended or unintended, of the policy under study on different groups? And then there's the other one for cost, for feasibility. So are they required human, material, and technological resources available? Is an important question for feasibility. So this can help you kind of structure those different sections to put kind of something concrete onto the paper in terms of what does it mean? Again, definitions. What does it mean to say feasibility, right? You can say in terms of, for my analysis, feasibility means, do we have the required human, material, and technological resources available? And is a policy a follow-up to probably don't care about that. Can the policy be administered by pre-existing mechanisms? Do we have to create whole new mechanisms, or can be administered by kind of our pre-existing mechanisms? All right, so now that we've got our evaluation criteria, now we have to identify our alternatives, right? And so how can we do that? And what are some of the alternatives we need to look at? So the first page to start is no action analysis, right? So it may sound strange, but in any policy evaluation where we're identifying alternative policies, one policy that is always possible, even when there's a problem, is doing nothing. And the reason that it's always a possibility is it's entirely possible in certain situations that even though there's a big problem that we want to be addressing, all of the available policy options that we consider actually are worse than the status quo. And so we're always going to want to be bearing in mind what the status quo is. Even though there is a problem we want to address, sometimes sometimes doing nothing isn't good, right? Because there's a problem, so obviously it's not good, but it still could be the best. And so you always want to bear in mind, one of the options is doing nothing. And so that's one of the ones that you're going to want to be doing for your comparison. So how do you come up with the other possible policy? So one is just literature review. So you want to be reading the academic literature, the policy literature on your problem, right? And that literature is going to be talking about different possible ways of dealing with it. Some might be theoretical, some might be more policy oriented, but from there you could be coming up with ideas for different possible solutions. So you're not the first person to ever be dealing with this problem. You may be the first person to deal with it in Canada or Quebec or the location you've dealt with. That's sometimes can be possible, although with most of the issues you're dealing with, unlikely, right? But you're not the first person ever to deal with that problem in general. So other people have written stuff, and so if you want to be figuring out solutions, the first place to look at is what have other people said, right? Use them to help you, right? You don't have to be doing it all by yourself. You could be building and should be building on what others have done. Comparison of real world experiences, right? So again, say we're talking about Canada dealing with income inequality, right? How have other countries, what programs have other countries put in to deal with income inequality, right? Because those programs may be ones that we can import into Canada and that may be helpful, right? So what have other countries done? What have other countries done to deal with trafficking, right? What programs have they put in? Because then we can look at how effective those were and see, are they, did they have, so then in the evaluation, you can be looking at how effective was the program and do we think it would be similarly effective in Canada? Is it feasible within Canada? And is it acceptable within Canada? And then in terms of kind of how we evaluate it. So a good starting point is to look at what have others done. Brainstorm. All of you have brains. So some of it is just thinking about, okay, so this is a problem. What would I do? What do I think makes sense in dealing with it? So some of it's going to be reading, some could be looking at other examples, but some of it's just going to be, coming up with your own ideas. And coming up with your own ideas is perfectly fine. It's always encouraged. And so you might come up with a solution that others haven't come up with before. Now, whenever you do come up with a solution you think no one's come up before, you should still do some reading. It may be that someone else has done already come up with it too, and A, you want to be giving them credit for it, but B, you could be integrating their ideas with theirs and improving it. Comparison with an ideal. So it might not be that people have ever uh, kind of other countries haven't implemented programs, but we may have an ideal of what we want. And so the alternative would be to compare with an ideal. So what is the ideal situation in terms of kind of policy? And use that as kind of a source for coming up with the policies that we would be wanting, right? So no income inequality. So a situation where taxation is kind of progressive, right? Where those who earn higher pay more taxes, right? That might be the ideal that you have in mind. And so then kind of the policy there would be something in forms of taxation. And then modifying existing solutions, right? So Canada may already have been putting in place solutions to deal with the problem, right? And rather than doing no action and just leaving those in place, it might be that you find that the program Canada's put in place is actually quite good, but it could be improved. And so your action might be do nothing. It might not be introduce a completely new program. You might find that we just need to modify something we're doing. If we're able to modify it in this small way or in this in a particular way, that you could drastically improve the outcomes and with say minimal costs and high feasibility because it's already in the mechanisms in place, everything like that. So modifying an existing solution, building off of what we're already doing, kind of working within existing programs, but improving them can be, one possible route. So for example, in the US right now, there's debates on healthcare, right? And some of the debates are, in terms, even within the Democratic Party is, were about, so how do we move healthcare forward in the US? Because there's clearly a problem. And so one solution that some put forward is we need to create a drastically new healthcare system, new healthcare program completely, pretty much, like a full public option. Others have said that we don't need to go the full public option. What we need to do is take the existing Obamacare and make it better. So Obamacare did a lot to help the problem, but there still are flaws. So we don't want to do nothing, but we can work within this existing mechanism and we can kind of change it. We can work within this existing framework and change it and produce something better. So modifying existing solutions is a possible option. So then once we've kind of come up with our different alternatives, we need to evaluate them. And in particular, so we need to kind of figure out what's going to happen in terms of kind of like all our evaluation. So how effective will this policy be? What will the unintended consequences be? What will the cost be? What will be the acceptability, right? So we need to be able to evaluate in terms of all of the evaluation criteria that we've selected. We need to evaluate each of the different alternatives, right? So ways that we can do it include extrapolation, right? So for example, say you're evaluating no action, right? So you could say, okay, so say the problem's been increasing 1% per year. If we do nothing, you can probably extrapolate that that trend's going to continue and the problem will continue to increase by 1% per year, right? If we don't insert any change to it, it's likely that the trend's going to continue. And so you can kind of look at trends. You could look at trends in other places and see when this policy came in, what were the trends, and what happened there. Now, you need to make an argument that we would have a similar trend in Canada, but you could kind of extrapolate that this policy leads to this type of growth, to this type of change. And so you can extrapolate from the past into the future, what's likely to happen in the future if this is there. So that's one, is kind of taking the past trend and having them kind of continue into the future to see, what is likely to be the effects of doing nothing, what's likely to be the cost of doing nothing, and potentially other policies as well. Theoretical forecasting, using a theory to predict policy outcomes, right? So many in the different social sciences have written about all kinds of different programs, all kinds of different problems. So for example, in economics, say you want to be dealing with income inequality and bringing in a new taxation system to deal with income inequality. Well, all kinds of economists have written thousands of papers on taxation, right? What would happen if you had a different taxation system? So if you want to figure out what are likely to be the consequences or the effects and unintended consequences and costs of different taxation systems, right? Then you should look at you can look at the economics literature and see what have they said is going to happen with these different systems, right? And kind of draw it from theory. So if we put in this type, economists have said, if you put in this type of taxation system, you would see a decrease in inequality, you'd see an increase in government funds, you'd see, or a decrease in government funds of X amount, blah, blah, blah. And so we can bring that into the scenario. And then intuitive forecasting. So this is qualitative analysis based on your judgment. So you're looking at the situation on the ground in Canada, you're seeing who are the different stakeholders involved in the problem, what's the process in Canada, what's the situation on the ground, what's the history in Canada, and you're making an argument based on logic and your judgment about what's likely to come in here. Now, this is probably where a lot of your analysis is going to go. It's also, it can be difficult in the sense that it's easiest because you're not bringing in theory or kind of trends to support you. It's easiest for people to kind of poke holes at, but it's also probably the easiest to do. So here, the important thing is to make sure that you can support your arguments. So it's less about your opinions, it's more about what you can support. And so you've evaluated these kind of, so you've done the evaluation. How do you present it? So this is where I said evaluating and displaying and selecting among alternatives kind of going to overlap. Because a lot of what you'll do for displaying and selecting among alternatives is kind of in terms of scenario writing. So for each of the different policies that you've identified, or for a subset of the policies that you think are kind of most likely to work, right? You can write out scenarios based on kind of the policy and the kind of evaluation criteria that you've got, and the evaluation that you, and then do the evaluation in terms of scenario. So if we do this, if we implement no action, right? We can extrapolate from the past and see that we believe this is going to be happening. And just based on our judgment of kind of current trends, we actually may even see the problem accelerate. The cost may accelerate, and the acceptability of doing nothing based on recent events in terms of this social movement is showing that the problem may become more, and doing nothing may become more and more untenable, right? So you could be doing that. So you're doing the evaluating one alternative in terms of writing a scenario, and then you do it for the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So brief, where you present kind of your evaluation in terms of each one in the scenario. You can also do paired comparisons, so kind of be doing two at once. So kind of taking two kind of similar type actions and comparing them. Now, one real, so you can combine kind of different methods. And so one method that a lot of kind of students kind of really like is they kind of write a scenario for each of them, where they kind of do the evaluation that that I showed kind of in this slide, right? So they do the kind of the evaluation here for each of the different ones. So they write a different scenario, but then they often end up with kind of two that they think might be best, right? They're having trouble deciding between two, right? Where, for example, one does best in terms of effects, but has some unintended consequences, or would be very costly, where another is slightly less good in terms of effect, but has lower costs, right? So what they'll then do at the end is kind of do a paired comparison, so they can kind of do a select. So they look at them side by side. They kind of have the final portion of the text where they look at them side by side, and then based on kind of the comparison are able to make the choice as to which one they're recommending. So those are kind of the different sections that can go into. Now, there is always also the monitoring outcomes that normally would happen in kind of policy analysis. That doesn't work in our paper, but all of it, so there's in yours, there'd kind of be 4-ish sections, right? So you'll have your verify, define, and detail the problem. as section 1. You'll have establish evaluation criteria, section 2. Identify alternative policy options, section 3. And then section 4 is kind of the evaluate, so display and select among, right? So you'll use the evaluation criteria to evaluate each of the different alternative ones, but often, like say, this is kind of done outside the paper, but it's kind of then presented in the paper. And usually students will do it in terms of different scenarios. So scenarios for each of the different ones where they've write out kind of their evaluation of what would happen if we implement these policies, and then they make the choice at the end on the policy that they want. Either just clearly one from when they lay out the different options that seems best, or there's two that look good, so then they do the comparison of the two to make the choice. And so kind of with the conclusion then at the end with the choice. So that's all for now. So at this point, the first step in the paper process will be having to choose a topic. Now, we'll be choosing a topic, I believe it's in about a week and a half. We'll have a class where we're all together on Zoom, and you get to kind of choose the one that you like. So in the next week and a half, I challenge you to start thinking about what are some issues that you would like to be discussing, right? And then once we kind of get into the once you've, then we'll present all of those, we'll choose which ones you're working on in the group, and then you can get started on the group project. There'll also be several classes, where you'll be able to kind of work with your group on the project to help you kind of start building up the knowledge that you're gonna need and kind of set goals for advancing on both the group project and the paper. So remember, the group project is separate, the paper is individual, but they're on the same general topic area, and the work you're doing on one is going to help you work on the other. All right, so that's it for now. So have a fantastic weekend, and I'll talk to you next week.